Folks, if you're trying to sleep and decided you need a story that calms the mind, but also makes you think a little, you've come to the right place. This is exactly the type of content made for you to settle into bed, close your eyes, and let your mind relax with some reflections on human nature. Today we're going to explore one of humanity's most universal obsessions. You know that thing about trying to be spiritually perfect? Yeah, that. Apparently, ever since the first human being had the brilliant idea of seeking enlightenment, we've been making the same basic mistake. We try to manufacture transcendence like someone assembling IKEA furniture. And look, it's not for lack of creativity. Throughout history, we've had people trying the most bizarre approaches to achieve spiritual perfection. Because nothing says, "I've figured out the mystery of existence," like trying to solve cosmic problems through megalomaniacal personal projects. What these people discovered was something that should probably be written in huge letters at the entrance of any temple. The quest for spiritual perfection is magnificently imperfect. And maybe that's exactly what makes it perfect. If you're enjoying this type of content to relax, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to not miss any new stories. This really helps the channel grow and motivates me to keep bringing these reflections to you. So get comfortable there. Take a deep breath, and let's discover together how human imperfection can be the most direct path to wisdom. Starting in 13th century Persia, where a man had an idea that would completely change his life. Once upon a time, there was a man named Mirza Attar who lived in Isfahan in the heart of 13th century Persia. Isfahan at that time was basically what Paris is today for fashion, but for perfumes. If you wanted the most sophisticated fragrance in the known world, you'd end up at Mirza's workshop. His workshop was something from another world. Imagine Aladdin's cave, but instead of gold, it had colored glass bottles full of essences that came from the entire Silk Road. Damascus roses, Indian sandalwood, ambergris that nobody really knew where it came from, Ceylon cinnamon. The man had access to ingredients that most people didn't even dream existed. Mirza was the guy who created exclusive perfumes for the Shah. You know those perfumes that only royalty could use? He was the one who made them. He had specific perfumes for each court occasion. One for receiving ambassadors, another for religious ceremonies, a third for when the Shah wanted to impress some foreign princess. The man was an artist of olfaction, a poet of fragrances. But here's where the story gets interesting. One day, Mirza was returning from the market when he witnessed a scene that changed his life forever. It was a dervish, one of those Sufi mystics who spin to enter spiritual trance. The man was there in the square, spinning slowly, and as he spun, something in his face kept changing. It wasn't just the expression. It was as if the very air around him became different. People stopped to look, and it wasn't because of the dance. It was because of something that radiated from the guy. A peace, a serenity, a presence you could feel from meters away. Mirza stood there, completely mesmerized. When the dervish finished, he opened his eyes and smiled at Mirza with a tranquility that seemed to come from another planet. It was at that moment that our perfumer had the most brilliant and most impossible idea of his life. He thought, if I can capture that essence, that transformation I just witnessed, and turn it into perfume, I'll create the most powerful fragrance that ever existed. Because in Mirza's mind, if you could distill roses, if you could extract sandalwood essence, why couldn't you bottle spiritual enlightenment? It was just a matter of finding the right formula, the adequate ingredients, the perfect proportion. After all, he was the best perfumer in Persia. If anyone could do it, it would be him. The obsession started very slowly. First, he began attending Sufi ceremonies, always with his little bottles, trying to capture some specific aroma from those moments of spiritual ecstasy. He thought maybe it was the incense used in the rituals, or some specific herb that the dervishes consumed before the dances. Mirza started mixing essences during dawn prayers, convinced that the spiritual moment of the day would influence the quality of the fragrance. He created a series of experiments that involved distilling water during the 5 daily prayers, believing that each time would have a different vibration that could be captured chemically. The man went so far as to try distilling his own meditation moments. He would meditate with a small alembic beside him, hoping that his own spiritual transformation would leave some aromatic trace in the air that could be collected and concentrated. It was impeccable logic, if you completely ignored how reality works. His wife, Zara, at first thought it was even cute. Look how interesting. My husband is mixing spirituality with profession. But as the months went by and he began neglecting court orders to focus on spiritual experiments, things became less romantic and more worrying. Clients started complaining. The Shah's perfume for the spring ceremony was 3 weeks late because Mirza was convinced he needed to collect dew during dawn on a Friday to give the final touch to the formula. Normal dew wouldn't work. It had to be spiritually charged dew. And so began a 20-year journey that would take Persia's best perfumer through the most tortuous paths of human obsession. Because when you decide you're going to solve the mysteries of the universe through your profession, life has a very particular way of teaching you about humility. In the first 2 years, Mirza convinced himself that the secret was in the right ingredients collected at the right moments. He developed increasingly elaborate theories about how to capture spiritual essence. His logic was simple. If incense helps in meditation, then incense used during real illumination should have special properties. He started following Sufi masters around the city, always with his little bottles and collection equipment. Imagine the scene. You're having a profound moment of connection with the divine, and there's a guy right there trying to capture your aura with a little glass tube. The dervishes were too polite to kick the man out, but their expressions were priceless. Mirza created a complex classification system for his experiments. He had bottles labeled as air collected during mystical ecstasy, Tuesday, waxing moon, and breath condensation during deep dikka, sample number 47. His workshop began to look like the laboratory of a mad alchemist specialized in spirituality. He tried to distill tears of joy from people who had transcendent experiences, because if tears carry emotion, then tears of enlightenment should carry enlightenment, right? The problem is it's not easy to convince someone to cry into a bottle during a sacred moment. People tend to find this kind of request a bit invasive. The obsession kept escalating. Mirza began traveling to places considered sacred, always carrying his aromatic collection kit. He went to tombs of Sufi saints trying to capture residual holiness essence. He visited caves where mystics had meditated for decades, convinced that the very air of these places would have been impregnated with wisdom. On one of these trips, he spent an entire week trying to distill water from a spring considered miraculous. Not common water from the spring, but water collected exactly at midnight during the new moon, while he recited specific verses from the Quran. Because, apparently, common miraculous water wasn't miraculous enough for his standards. The result of all these experiments was an impressive collection of bottles with liquids that smelled exactly like you'd expect liquids collected under bizarre circumstances to smell. That is, not good at all. But Mirza had an infinite capacity to find deep meaning in disappointing results. When the extract of nocturnal contemplation smelled like mold, he interpreted it as a sign that he needed to better purify the collection environment. When the essence of collective prayer produced an aroma reminiscent of old vinegar, he decided it was because the group's spiritual sincerity wasn't at the adequate level. Zara tried to talk to her husband about the direction the obsession was taking. "Dear, maybe enlightenment isn't something that can be bottled." But Mirza had an answer for everything. If we can capture the essence of a rose, which is beauty in physical form, why couldn't we capture the essence of spiritual beauty? It was logic that made sense if you didn't think too much about it, and Mirza had spent so much time immersed in the obsession that thinking clearly about it had become almost impossible. He was convinced he was on the right path, just a few technical adjustments away from revolutionizing human spirituality. The court clients began to get impatient. The perfume for the vizier's daughter's wedding was delayed because Mirza decided he needed to incorporate essence of matrimonial blessing into the formula. He spent 2 weeks trying to distill rose petals that had been blessed by an imam during a wedding ceremony. The irony is that while Mirza became increasingly obsessed with capturing spirituality, he himself was moving away from any real spiritual experience. His prayer moments became experiment planning sessions. His meditation turned into time for scientific observation of his own internal reactions, trying to identify what would be the exact moment to collect his own illuminated essence. He reached the point of trying to synchronize his meditative states with distillation processes. He would meditate with an alembic running beside him, believing that his own altered state of consciousness would somehow chemically influence what was being distilled. It was like trying to capture music in a bottle by recording the silence around a violin. But Mirza was just getting started. Because when you're convinced you have the key to solving humanity's spiritual problems, 2 years of failed experiments aren't enough to convince you otherwise. They're just evidence that you need to better refine your approach. And that's exactly what he did. In the 3rd year, Mirza had a revelation that completely changed his approach. He decided the problem wasn't the ingredients or collection methods. The problem was that he was thinking too small. If he wanted to capture real enlightenment, he needed a project worthy of the spiritual grandeur he was trying to bottle. That's when he announced to Zara that he would create the greatest spiritual alchemy laboratory the world had ever seen. No more casual experiments in the workshop. Now it would be an industrial-scale operation for distilling transcendence, because if you're going to try to do the impossible, better do it right. He sold part of the family's assets to build an entire complex dedicated to the experiments. There were 12 different rooms, each specialized in an aspect of spiritual capture. One room just for distillation during prayers, another for experiments with crystals and precious stones that would amplify spiritual vibrations, a third for tests with different moon phases. Mirza hired assistants whom he personally trained in his theories about transcendental perfumery. Poor souls spent hours learning the difference between morning contemplation essence and evening contemplation essence. There were entire manuals on how to identify the exact moment when a person reached mystical ecstasy so that aromatic collection could be done with perfect timing. The obsession became science. Mirza developed complex tables correlating lunar phases with spiritual intensity of different saints. He had charts showing how wind direction affected the quality of essences collected during religious rituals. It was impressive work documenting things that didn't exist. He began importing ingredients impossible to find. Ganges River water collected during eclipses, sand from Mecca gathered by pilgrims in states of religious ecstasy, Tibetan lotus petals that had been exposed to Buddhist chants for at least a week. The man was literally buying miracles wholesale. Zara watched it all with a mixture of admiration and terror. On one hand, she had never seen her husband so dedicated to something. On the other hand, she was watching the family's wealth disappear to finance experiments that produced fragrances smelling of failure in increasingly higher concentrations. The results continued being disastrous, but Mirza had developed an extraordinary ability to reinterpret disasters as progress. When an experiment produced a smell that made people run away, he didn't see failure. He saw a sign that he had captured some kind of spiritual energy so potent that common people couldn't bear it. He created a theory about gradual audience purification. According to Mirza, his spiritual fragrances could only be appreciated by people who had already reached a certain level of spiritual development. If you thought it smelled bad, it was a sign that you needed to work more on your inner evolution. It was a criticism-proof theory. In the 5th year, Mirza announced he had identified the missing ingredient, time. Not common time, but spiritually charged time. He decided his experiments needed to be aged under specific conditions that replicated environments of high mystical concentration. That's when he built a special room where experimental fragrances were stored, while he and his assistants took 24-hour shifts of prayer and meditation around the bottles. The idea was that constant spiritual atmosphere would mature the essences until they reached transcendental perfection. The neighbors began to think Mirza had gone completely mad. There were always people coming and going from his house, carrying strange bottles and murmuring prayers. The place smelled like a mixture of chemistry laboratory and abandoned temple. It was an olfactory combination that nobody quite knew how to interpret. Mirza completely stopped serving regular clients. When the Shah himself sent to ask about the delay in the perfume for the solstice celebration, Mirza replied that he was busy with research that would revolutionize humanity's relationship with the sacred. The Shah was so confused by the response that he Forgot to be irritated. Zara tried one last serious conversation with her husband. Mirza, you've already spent more money trying to capture enlightenment than most people earn in a lifetime. Maybe it's time to consider that this path isn't leading where you expected. But Mirza was too far gone to listen to reason. He had convinced himself he was on the threshold of a discovery that would change the world. Zara, you don't understand. I'm about to make it possible for anyone to experience enlightenment simply by inhaling a fragrance. Imagine the good this will bring to humanity. It was a noble vision, if you ignored the fact that after 5 years of intensive experiments, the only thing Mirza had achieved was a collection of bottles with liquids that smelled progressively worse. But the obsession had created its own reality, where failure was just disguised success waiting to be revealed. And Mirza was determined to keep revealing until he succeeded. In the 10th year, reality began knocking on Mirza's door with the delicacy of an irritated rhinoceros. The money had run out. Creditors were starting to show up at his house with worrying frequency. And worst of all, not a single bottle from his experiments had produced anything that remotely resembled a usable fragrance. Zara had to start selling her jewelry to keep the house running. The assistants left one by one when Mirza stopped being able to pay salaries. The spiritual laboratory complex became an abandoned museum of human obsession, full of expensive equipment collecting dust and bottles with liquids nobody dared to open. But Mirza still couldn't accept that maybe he was chasing something impossible. Instead of questioning the basic premise of the experiments, he decided the problem was that he wasn't being ambitious enough. If 10 years of work hadn't been sufficient, obviously he needed 10 more years. That's when he had his most desperate career idea: sell the house itself to finance one last definitive experiment. Zahra nearly fainted when he announced the plan. Mirza, you're talking about leaving us homeless to continue an obsession that's already left us penniless. Zahra, you don't understand, Mirza replied with eyes shining with fervor. I'm so close to a revolutionary discovery that I can feel it in the air, literally. Just yesterday, during my morning meditation, I noticed a different aroma emanating from my own being. It's a sign that I'm finally becoming receptive to higher spiritual frequencies. What Mirza didn't know was that the different aroma he was perceiving was the result of spending so much time locked in the laboratory with questionable chemicals that he had lost much of his normal sense of smell. But to an obsessed mind, any sensory change can be interpreted as spiritual progress. Zara tried a different approach. Dear, let's suppose you're right, and it is possible to capture enlightenment in a bottle. Have you considered the possibility that maybe you're not the right person to do this? Maybe this discovery is destined for someone more spiritually prepared. It was an intelligent argument, appealing to humility. But Mirza had been beyond the reach of humility for many years. Zara, if I give up now, all these years of research will have been in vain. Besides, who else in the world has the technical knowledge and spiritual dedication necessary for this endeavor? The sad truth was that Mirza had become the least spiritually qualified person to capture enlightenment. Years of obsession had transformed a genuine search into ego disguised as spirituality. He was so focused on being the guy who would solve the universe's mysteries that he had completely forgotten to pay attention to the mysteries of his own life. In the 15th year, the inevitable happened. Creditors took the house, the laboratory, and practically everything Mirza owned. He and Zara had to move to a tiny little house on the outskirts of Isfahan. It was a devastating social fall for someone who had been the city's most respected perfumer. Mirza fell into deep depression. For the first time in 15 years, he went entire days without touching any distillation equipment. He would sit on the little house's porch looking at the horizon, trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. How had such a noble quest ended in such complete failure? It was during one of these moments of forced contemplation that Zara made a suggestion that would change everything. Mirza, why don't you go talk to that dervish who inspired this whole journey? If he's still alive, maybe he can help you understand what happened. Mirza resisted the idea at first. Talking to the dervish would be admitting failure. It would be recognizing that 15 years of intensive work hadn't led anywhere. But when you've lost everything you owned, chasing an impossible dream, pride becomes a luxury you can no longer afford. Here's the translation of the third part. After a few days of hesitation, Mirza decided to seek out the dervish. It wasn't hard to find him. The man still frequented the same square where Mirza had first seen him, only now he was visibly older. Completely white hair, face marked by time, but the same serene eyes that had impressed Mirza decades ago. When Mirza approached, the dervish recognized him immediately. "Ah, the perfumer who wanted to bottle enlightenment. How was your journey, my friend?" The question was asked with genuine kindness, without any trace of irony or judgment. Mirza told the whole story. The years of experiments, the resources spent, the growing obsession, the loss of everything. He spoke for almost an hour, unloading 15 years of accumulated frustration. The dervish listened to everything in silence, only occasionally nodding his head. When Mirza finished, the dervish smiled with the same serenity as always. "My dear friend, you spent 15 years trying to capture something you already possessed from the beginning. The enlightenment you saw in me that afternoon didn't come from outside. It was inside me all along, just waiting to be recognized." It was the simplest and most devastating answer Mirza could have received. The dervish's words hit Mirza like a punch to the stomach, made of pure clarity. 15 years of complex experiments, elaborate theories, sophisticated equipment, and the answer had been there in front of him the whole time. So obvious it was invisible, so simple it seemed impossible. "But then," Mirza asked with a trembling voice, "how do I access this enlightenment that's inside me? What's the technique? What's the method?" Even faced with the revelation, the perfumer's mind still sought formulas and procedures. 15 years of methodological obsession don't disappear in one conversation. The dervish laughed gently. "My friend, you're asking the wrong question. It's not about doing, it's about stopping doing. You spent so much time trying to capture enlightenment that you forgot to simply be present for it. It's like trying to catch your own shadow. The more you chase it, the more it moves away." Mirza was silent for a long time, processing this information. His whole life had been about technique, precision, controlling variables. The idea that the answer could lie in the absence of technique was almost incomprehensible to him. It was like asking a fish to understand life outside water. "So you mean," Mirza spoke slowly, "that I don't need special ingredients? I don't need equipment? I don't need collection methods?" The dervish confirmed with a nod. "You don't need to capture anything because you already are what you were trying to capture." It was a moment of profound silence. Mirza felt something inside him break and reorganize at the same time. It was as if 15 years of accumulated tension dissolved all at once. He began to cry. Not from sadness, but from relief. The relief of finally being able to stop chasing something impossible. The dervish sat beside him, while Mirza processed the discovery. "You know what's the most ironic part of your story?" asked the mystic. "You always had the gift of creating fragrances that touched people deeply. Your perfumes already carried something special because they came from someone who was genuinely seeking beauty. You just didn't realize it." It was true. Before the obsession, Mirza's perfumes were famous not only for their technical quality, but for something indefinable that made them unique. People said that wearing one of his perfumes was like wearing a bit of poetry, but he had abandoned that simplicity in search of something more grandiose. Mirza returned home with a completely different perspective. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't carrying bottles, equipment, or theories about spiritual distillation. He was just walking, paying attention to the path, to people, to the present moment. It was surprisingly relaxing. Zahra noticed the change immediately. "What happened to you? You seem different." Mirza told her about the conversation with the dervish and about his discovery that he had been looking outside for something that was always inside. "So you're going to stop the experiments?" she asked, somewhat afraid to nurture hope. "I'm going back to making perfumes," Mirza replied. "But simple perfumes. Perfumes made with presence, not with obsession. Perfumes that celebrate the beauty that already exists instead of trying to create impossible beauty." It was a radically different approach from what he had followed for 15 years. Mirza started small, very small. With the few resources he had left, he bought some common roses from the local market. Not special roses collected during specific rituals, just normal roses, chosen with attention and care. He distilled them using traditional techniques he had learned decades ago. The process was a meditation. Instead of trying to force some spiritual result, he simply concentrated on each step of the distillation. The smell of the roses, the water temperature, the rhythm of boiling. It was simple work, but done with a presence he had lost during the years of obsession. The result was rose water of extraordinary purity. It had nothing supernatural or transcendental. It was just rose essence distilled with love and total attention. But when Zahra tried it, she began to cry. "This is it," she said. "This is what I missed in your perfumes. This simplicity." Mirza understood he had discovered something more valuable than any impossible mystical fragrance. He had rediscovered the magic that always existed in work well done, in genuine attention, in total presence dedicated to the moment. It wasn't bottled enlightenment, but it was something much better. It was lived enlightenment. In the years that followed, Mirza rebuilt his reputation creating simple but extraordinary perfumes. They weren't famous for mystical spiritual properties, but for an indefinable quality that touched people. It was the quality of presence, of loving attention, of work done with full consciousness, and every time someone asked what was the secret of his perfumes, Mirza would smile and answer, "The secret is having no secret. It's just being completely present to what you're doing." It was the simplest and most profound lesson he had learned in an entire life, dedicated to the search for perfection. And so ends the story of the perfumer who wanted to bottle enlightenment. Mirza discovered that transcendence is not something you capture, but something you live. 15 years trying to distill the mystery of existence when the answer was there, as simple as a common rose treated with total attention. But apparently, trying to express the inexpressible through art is a universal human obsession. Because on the other side of the world, in 15th century India, a dancer was about to discover that creating perfect choreography for abstract concepts is almost as complicated as bottling enlightenment. Only instead of bottles and alembics, she used gestures and movements, and instead of trying to capture spiritual essence in liquid, she wanted to transmit ancestral wisdom through the body. It was basically the same obsession, just with more sequins and less risk of chemical explosion. In the 15th century, at the court of the Raja of Vijayanagara, in southern India, lived a dancer named Kamala Devi. She was the court's first dancer, which at the time was basically like being the main star of a show that never ended. Every day there were performances. Every festival needed special choreography, and the pressure to create something new and impressive was constant. Kamala was a master of the traditional art of Indian dance, that form of expression where each gesture has specific meaning, each movement tells a story, and each facial expression can transmit complex emotions. It was such a rich body language that you could narrate entire epics just through hand gestures and foot positions. Her life was good, respected, well paid, living in the palace, with access to the best teachers and the best musicians in the region. It was the kind of position that most dancers of the era only dreamed of achieving. Kamala had everything an artist could desire: recognition, financial stability, and almost total creative freedom. But then something happened that completely changed the direction of her life. During a performance for a delegation of visiting Buddhist monks, one of the religious men made a comment that echoed in Kamala's head for weeks. He said, "Your dance is beautiful, but it makes me think about the impermanence of all beauty. How interesting it would be if you could express that through movement. Impermanence. The idea that everything in life is temporary, that nothing remains the same forever, that even the most beautiful and precious things eventually transform or disappear." It was a concept Kamala knew intellectually, but had never thought about how to express through dance. From that day on, she became obsessed with the idea: how do you choreograph something as abstract as the temporary nature of all things? How do you translate a deep, philosophical concept into movements that anyone can understand just by watching? Kamala started small. First, she tried to create gestures that represented things disappearing, movements that began defined and gradually became softer until they completely dissolved. It was beautiful to watch, but when she asked people what they had understood, the answers were always something like, very delicate dance, or interesting movements. Nobody was catching the message about impermanence. To them, it was just experimental choreography with different aesthetics. Kamala realized she needed to be clearer, more direct. If she wanted to transmit a specific idea, she couldn't depend on subtleties that might go unnoticed. That's when she decided to create a sequence of movements representing the complete cycle of life: birth, growth, peak, decline, and death. Each phase would have specific gestures, different rhythms, appropriate facial expressions. It would be a universal biography told through the body. She spent months developing this choreography. She studied plant growth to understand how to translate gradual development into movement. She observed elderly people to capture the essence of aging through gestures. She visited funeral ceremonies to understand how to express death in a respectful but clear way. The result was a 40-minute presentation that was technically impressive. Kamala had created a completely new body language to express abstract concepts. It was the kind of artistic innovation that would normally be celebrated as creative genius, but when she presented it to the court, the reaction was almost total confusion. People watched in respectful silence, applauded politely at the end, and then spent time talking among themselves trying to understand what they had just seen. It was interesting, but what exactly was she trying to say? Kamala was frustrated. She had spent months creating a work about one of the most fundamental concepts of human existence, and people were treating it like experimental entertainment. It was like writing a profound poem about the meaning of life, and people only praising the quality of the calligraphy. She decided the problem was that she was being too subtle. If she wanted to transmit impermanence, she needed to be more obvious. That's when she began the second version of the choreography, this time with visual elements that would make the message impossible to ignore. Kamala began incorporating objects that fell apart during the performance, flower petals that fell while she danced, fabrics that gradually came loose, revealing different layers of clothes underneath. It was choreography that physically changed as it progressed, forcing the audience to witness transformation in real time. It was a brilliant idea in theory. In practice, it became a performance where half the audience's attention was focused on hoping the clothes wouldn't fall at the wrong time, and the props wouldn't hurt anyone when they flew around the room. And so began a 5-year journey that would take the court's most talented dancer through the most tortuous paths of artistic obsession. Here's the translation of the fourth part. In the second year of the obsession, Kamala decided the problem was in the approach. Instead of trying to represent impermanence through obvious symbols, she needed to find a way to make people experience the sensation directly through movement. It was a subtle but important distinction, not to show about impermanence, but to make people feel impermanence. She began studying how different types of movement affected people's emotions. Fast movements generated anxiety. Slow movements induced calm. Repetitive movements created hypnosis. Kamala was convinced there was a specific combination of gestures that could induce deep understanding about the temporary nature of all things. That's when she had the idea of creating a dance that would change unpredictably during the presentation. Without warning the audience, she would alternate between completely different styles in the middle of the performance. She would start with traditional classical dance, change to tribal movements, then to contemplative gestures, ending with something completely abstract. The logic was that if people couldn't hold on to a specific style, if they couldn't predict what would come next, they would automatically experience the instability and uncertainty that are central characteristics of impermanence. It was psychology applied through the art of movement. Kamala spent months rehearsing these abrupt transitions. It was technically challenging because each dance style required different body posture, different rhythm, even different breathing. It was like being 5 different dancers in a single presentation. The first time she presented this version to the court was an educational disaster. The audience was visibly uncomfortable with the sudden changes. Some people began murmuring among themselves, others left in the middle of the presentation. At the end, the silence was embarrassing. When the Raja asked what was the purpose of that performance, Kamala enthusiastically explained about impermanence, about how she was trying to make people experience universal instability through dance. The Raja listened politely and then said, "Ah, I see. It's experimental dance. Very interesting." Kamala realized she had managed to make people feel uncomfortable, but they interpreted the discomfort as artistic failure, not as spiritual insight. It was like trying to teach someone about patience by irritating them on purpose. Technically it worked, but the lesson was lost in the emotional reaction. She decided to try a different approach. Instead of abrupt changes, she would create choreography where the movements transformed so gradually it would be almost imperceptible. People would start watching one type of dance and, without realizing exactly when, would be seeing something completely different. It was a sophisticated idea that required extraordinary body control. Kamala needed to make transitions so smooth that each moment of the dance flowed naturally to the next, but the final result was completely different from the beginning. It was like watching metamorphosis in slow motion. She spent an entire year developing this technique. She practiced hours daily, creating sequences where each gesture was slightly different from the previous one, but the difference was so small it was only perceptible when you compared the beginning with the end. The result was a hypnotic presentation. People became completely absorbed watching, unable to identify exactly what was happening, but feeling that something was constantly changing. It was like watching clouds forming in the sky. You knew you were seeing transformation, but couldn't pinpoint the exact moment of change. This time the reaction was much more positive. People praised the technique, the creativity, the way she managed to maintain the audience's attention for so long. Many said it was one of the most memorable presentations they had ever seen. But when Kamala asked if anyone had caught the message about impermanence, the answers were disappointing. It was very beautiful, very relaxing, impressive technique, very original. Nobody mentioned having any insight about the temporary nature of existence. Kamala was beginning to suspect she might be trying to do something impossible. How do you transmit philosophical understanding through body movement? How do you make someone understand an abstract concept just by watching a dance? She talked to other court artists about the problem. A musician told her, "Kamala, music can evoke emotions, but it can't teach mathematics. Maybe dance can inspire reflection, but it can't transmit specific knowledge." It was a sensible observation, but Kamala wasn't ready to accept limitations. She had dedicated 2 years of her life to this project. She wasn't going to give up just because it was getting difficult. If other artists couldn't mix art with philosophy, that only proved she was trying something truly innovative. That's when she decided to try the most ambitious approach of all. A dance that not only represented impermanence, but that forced the audience to confront their own resistance to change. It was psychology, philosophy, and art, combined in a single performance. And that's when things got really complicated. In the 3rd year, Kamala had a revelation that completely changed her approach. She realized it wasn't enough to make people see or feel impermanence passively. They needed to be forced to actively participate in the experience of change. They needed to be placed in situations where they had no choice but to confront their own resistance to what is temporary. That's when she created what she called participatory dance of transformation. The idea was that the audience would not just be spectators, but integral parts of the performance. As the dance progressed, people would be invited to gradually abandon their expectations about what was happening. Kamala began creating presentations where she would stop in the middle of the dance and ask people to change places, or where. She distributed objects for the audience to hold, and then asked them to pass them to the person next to them every few minutes. The idea was to create physical and emotional discomfort that mirrored the discomfort of accepting constant change. The first time she tried this approach was during a religious festival at court. Kamala distributed flowers to everyone in the audience and explained that as the dance progressed, they would have to keep giving the flowers to other people according to specific signals she would give through her movements. It seemed like an innocent idea, but in practice it became chaos. People were more worried about understanding the signals and following instructions than actually watching the dance itself. Half the audience completely missed the timing of the exchanges. The other half was so anxious about doing the right thing that they couldn't relax and simply experience the moment. Kamala interpreted the confusion as partial success. "You're feeling exactly what I wanted you to feel," she announced to the audience after the presentation. "That discomfort with uncertainty, that difficulty in letting go of control, that's impermanence." The problem was that people didn't want a philosophy lesson disguised as entertainment. They wanted to watch a beautiful dance and relax. When the Raja politely asked if she could return to more traditional presentations, Kamala was disappointed, but not discouraged. She decided the problem was that she was being too gentle. If she really wanted to force people to confront impermanence, she needed to create more challenging situations. That's when she developed what she called choreography of detachment. The new approach involved starting the dance with visual elements that people found beautiful, familiar music, colorful clothes, graceful movements, and then systematically removing each of these elements until only basic movement in total silence remained. Kamala would start dancing with elaborate clothing full of bells and ornaments that created melodious sounds with each movement. After a few minutes, she would stop and remove the bells. A few minutes later, she would remove the ornaments. Then she would change to simpler clothing. Then she would stop the music. At the end, there would be just her in simple white clothing, dancing in complete silence. The intention was to make people experience the process of losing things they had begun to appreciate. It was a physical metaphor for how life constantly takes away things we become attached to. Technically, it worked. People definitely felt discomfort as the presentation became increasingly austere. Many commented afterward that it was an intense emotional experience that made them think about how they attached to material things. But instead of gratitude for the spiritual lesson, the general reaction was irritation. People felt manipulated. It was like going to a restaurant expecting a tasty meal and receiving a lecture about world hunger. Technically educational, but not what they had asked for. The court musician who had tried to warn Kamala about art's limitations came to talk to her again. "Kamala, you're trying to use dance as bitter medicine. People resist not because they don't understand the lesson, but because they don't want to be medicated without consent." Here's the translation of the fifth part. It was a profound observation, but Kamala was too far into the obsession to listen. She had convinced herself that people's resistance was exactly proof that they needed the medicine she was offering. If they became uncomfortable, it was a sign they were being forced to grow spiritually. "True art must challenge people," she would respond to any criticism. "If they're feeling uncomfortable, it's because I'm touching truths they prefer to avoid." Kamala began creating increasingly confrontational presentations, dances that stopped abruptly in the middle, leaving the audience in suspense, choreographies that involved repetitive movements that deliberately tested people's patience, performances where she danced with her back to the audience, forcing them to question their expectations about entertainment. Each experiment was justified as a lesson about different aspects of impermanence. Forced suspense was about accepting uncertainty. Excessive repetition was about finding beauty in monotony. Dancing with her back turned was about releasing the need to be the center of attention. The justifications made sense in theory, but in practice, the presentations were becoming more like psychological experiments than art. And the audience was starting to actively avoid Kamala's performances. That's when she realized she might be on the wrong path. Not because she was failing to transmit impermanence, but because she was succeeding so well that nobody wanted to watch anymore. In the fourth year, Kamala faced a problem no artist wants to face. People simply stopped showing up to her presentations. It wasn't organized boycott or formal criticism. It was something worse, polite indifference. The kind of situation where people say, "Oh, how interesting," and then invent urgent commitments whenever you mention your next performance. The first time she noticed the pattern was during the Spring Festival. Traditionally, her presentations attracted the entire court. This time, exactly 7 people showed up, including 2 musicians who were being paid to be there, and a guard who clearly preferred to be anywhere else in the palace. Kamala danced with the same intensity as always. presenting her latest creation about accepting loss through conscious movement. It was choreography where she gradually removed each decorative element from the stage while dancing, ending in a completely empty space. It was pure symbolism transformed into visual experience. The problem is that when you have an audience of 7 people watching you systematically remove all the beautiful objects from the environment, the thing becomes less deeply symbolic and more strangely melancholic. It was like watching someone move house in slow motion, only with more expressive gestures. At the end of the presentation, the silence was so profound you could hear the crickets outside. One person in the audience coughed, another shifted uncomfortably in their chair. The guard checked the son's position through the window, mentally calculating how much time was left in his shift. Kamala asked if anyone wanted to comment on the experience. An elderly court lady, who had always been polite with all artists, said diplomatically, "It was very thoughtful, dear. It was the kind of compliment that means absolutely nothing and everyone knows it." After that presentation, Kamala had to face an uncomfortable reality. She had become the dancer people avoided. Not because she was technically bad, her skill remained impeccable, but because watching her performances had become emotional work that nobody had volunteered for. It was like being invited to dinner and discovering the host had decided to turn the meal into a seminar about world hunger. Technically important, philosophically valid, but not exactly what you expected when you accepted the invitation. Kamala tried to talk to other court artists about the problem. The main musician's response was gentle but devastating. "Kamala, when people go to an artistic presentation, they want to be touched, inspired, or at least entertained. You're offering mandatory therapy disguised as dance." "But true art must transform people," Kamala argued. "If they're avoiding transformation, maybe it's because they need it even more." The musician sighed. "My dear, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And you definitely can't make it reflect on the temporary nature of thirst while drinking." It was a strange analogy, but the point was clear. Kamala had become so focused on transmitting the message that she had forgotten to make the experience attractive. It was like a doctor who insists on giving bitter medicine without sugar because suffering is part of the cure. The situation worsened when she discovered people had started calling her presentations the depression dances. It wasn't malicious. It was just a way to differentiate them from the court's other more cheerful performances. But it hurt nonetheless. Kamala decided she might need a more subtle approach. Instead of forcing people to confront impermanence, she would create presentations so beautiful that they would naturally reflect on the temporary nature of beauty. It was reverse psychology applied to philosophy applied to art. Her new strategy was to create dances that were genuinely enchanting, but with subtle elements that would gradually direct people's attention to deeper themes. It was like hiding vitamins in tasty food. People would receive spiritual nutrition without realizing they were being educated. The problem was that after 3 years creating intentionally uncomfortable performances, Kamala had lost the touch for simply entertaining. It was like a chef who spent so much time making diet food that they forgot how to make something that tasted good. Her attempts to be subtly profound came out forced and obvious. Her first attempt at secretly educational dance was about the beauty of changing seasons. The idea was that people would engage with the visual beauty and gradually perceive the message about natural cycles and accepting change. But Kamala had become so accustomed to explaining her intentions that she couldn't resist giving hints during the performance. She would stop between movements to comment, "Notice how spring naturally gives way to summer. This represents our tendency to resist life's natural transitions." It was like watching a movie with someone who insists on explaining the symbolism of each scene. Technically correct, but completely destructive to the experience. The few people who showed up left during intermission. That's when Kamala finally had to confront the possibility that maybe she was trying to do something impossible. Not technically impossible, but artistically counterproductive. Maybe dance simply wasn't the ideal vehicle for transmitting complex philosophical concepts. But admitting this would mean recognizing that 4 years of intensive work had been based on a flawed premise, and Kamala wasn't ready for that admission. Not yet. In the 5th year, Kamala had an experience that changed everything. It was during a private presentation for a visiting noble family, one of the few that still accepted invitations to watch her performances. She was in the middle of choreography about embracing impermanence through fluid movement when something completely unexpected happened. A child of about 6 who was in the audience began imitating her movements, not because she understood the philosophical concept behind the dance, but simply because she found it beautiful and fun. The child knew nothing about impermanence, wasn't trying to learn profound lessons about life. She was just moving with pure joy. Kamala stopped dancing and watched the girl. It was the first time. In years she had seen someone responding to her movements with genuine pleasure, without resistance, without analysis, without discomfort. The child was simply present in the moment, experiencing dance as dance. It was like a punch to the stomach made of clarity. Kamala realized she had spent 5 years trying to force people to learn through art, when art works best, when it simply allows people to be naturally touched. It was like trying to force someone to fall in love by explaining the psychological benefits of love. After the presentation, Kamala talked with the child's mother. "Your daughter has natural talent for dance," she commented. "She responded to the movements very intuitively." "Oh, she loves to dance," the mother replied. "At home she dances to any music she hears, not to learn anything specific, just because she feels like it." Dancing because she feels like it. What a revolutionary concept. Kamala had become so obsessed with using dance as an educational tool that she had forgotten dance can simply be expression of joy, beauty for the pleasure of beauty, movement for the pleasure of movement. She decided to do an experiment. Instead of creating a presentation with a specific message, she would create a dance that was just beautiful. No hidden agenda, no disguised lessons, no attempts to transform anyone, just expressive movement that celebrated the joy of being alive. It was harder than she expected. After 5 years, thinking of each gesture as a symbol of something greater, Kamala had lost the ability to simply move. It was like a writer who became so obsessed with metaphors that they forgot how to tell a simple story. She had to relearn basic techniques she had known since childhood, how to let the body respond naturally to music, how to allow emotions to flow through movement without trying to control them or direct them toward specific educational ends, how to dance for dancing's sake. It took weeks of practice to achieve a 15-minute presentation that was genuinely spontaneous. It was like unlearning 5 years of mental habits in a few weeks. Every time she began to dance, her mind automatically started looking for symbolic meanings in the movements. When she finally achieved a version that satisfied her, Kamala announced a special presentation at court. She didn't say what the theme was, didn't explain artistic intentions, didn't give any philosophical preparation. She simply invited people to watch dance. Here's the translation of the 6th part. To her surprise, a larger audience showed up than she had seen in 2 years. Apparently, the absence of a declared educational agenda had made the experience more attractive. People were curious to see what Kamala would do without her usual complicated theories. The presentation was a revelation. For the first time in years, Kamala saw people in the audience completely relax. She saw genuine smiles, expressions of simple pleasure, the kind of response she used to receive before becoming an educator, disguised as an artist. At the end, the applause was the warmest she had received since the beginning of the obsession. One lady commented, "It was beautiful, Kamala. It reminded me why I love dance." Another spectator said, "It was very moving. It made me think of beautiful things." The most interesting thing was that several people commented on reflections the dance had inspired. But instead of forced lessons about impermanence, they were personal thoughts that had arisen naturally from the experience of watching beautiful movement. It was exactly what Kamala had tried to achieve for 5 years, only happening organically when she stopped trying to force it. After the presentation, the court musician who had tried to warn her about the dangers of medicinal art came to talk. "Now that's it," he said, smiling. "That was art that touches people without hurting them in the process." Kamala laughed for the first time in a long time. Apparently the best way to teach impermanence is not to try to teach impermanence. "Exactly," agreed the musician. Art works like perfume. When it's good, people notice. When you force people to smell it, they run away. It was a strange analogy coming from someone who worked with sound, but it made perfect sense. Kamala had discovered that real influence happens through inspiration, not through instruction. When art is genuinely touching, people naturally reflect on important things. When it's forced to be educational, it becomes work. In the following years, Kamala returned to creating dances that were simply beautiful. Some inspired deep reflections in people, others just provided moments of joy. Both results were valid because they were genuine. She had learned that the best way to share wisdom through art is to stop trying to share wisdom through art. It was the kind of lesson that can only be learned after years of trying to do exactly the opposite. And every time she saw a child dancing with pure joy, Kamala smiled, remembering that sometimes the deepest wisdom lies in simply allowing beautiful things to be beautiful. Without agenda, without forced education, without attempts to capture the uncapturable, just movement, music, and the inexplicable joy of being alive. And so ends the story of the dancer who wanted to choreograph impermanence. Kamala discovered that the best way to transmit wisdom through art is to stop trying to transmit wisdom through art. 5 years trying to force revelations when the answer lay in simply allowing beautiful things to be beautiful. But human obsession with controlling the uncontrollable doesn't stop there. Because in Ming Dynasty China, a gardener was convinced he could demonstrate the interdependence of all phenomena through scientifically precise horticulture. Liu Wei-chen had decided that if he could perfectly control every variable of an ecosystem, he could create a garden that functioned as living proof of how everything in existence is connected. It was basically the same obsession as Kamala's, only instead of trying to capture abstract concepts through movement, he wanted to cultivate them through plants. The difference is that plants don't applaud when you force them to cooperate with your philosophical theories. They simply die. Which, come to think of it, is also a form of communication. Liu Wei-chen was the principal landscape designer of the imperial gardens of Beijing during the Ming Dynasty in the 15th century. It was the kind of job we would today call landscape architect, only back then the official title was more pompous. Supreme harmonizer of natural elements in service of imperial serenity. Because if you're going to tend plants for the emperor, you better have a title worthy of the responsibility. Liu was exceptional at his job. His gardens were famous throughout China for a perfect combination of natural beauty and intentional design. He could make it appear that nature had spontaneously organized itself in an artistically perfect way, when in reality, each stone, each tree, each stream had been positioned with mathematical precision. His specialty was contemplative gardens, those spaces where important people went to meditate on life's profound questions. Gardens with strategically positioned bridges for reflection, pavilions located at exact points where the view inspired wisdom, paths designed to induce specific mental states as you walked. Liu understood that gardens could influence people's state of mind. He knew that certain plant combinations created sensations of peace, that specific stone arrangements generated feelings of stability, that the sound of running water at different speeds produced different types of mental calm. It was psychology applied through horticulture. His life was good, respected by the court, well compensated, with access to the best resources and materials from across the empire. He had a team of specialist gardeners, practically unlimited budget, and total creative freedom to experiment. It was the dream of anyone who works with landscaping. But then Liu encountered an idea that completely changed his perspective on gardening. During a conversation with a visiting Buddhist monk, he heard about the concept of universal interdependence, the idea that everything in existence is connected in invisible ways, that nothing exists independently of everything else. Imagine, the monk explained, that you could see all the connections between all things, each plant depending on the soil depending on the worms depending on the falling leaves, the leaves depending on the trees depending on the rain depending on the clouds depending on the oceans, everything connected in an infinite network of interdependence. Liu was fascinated by this idea. As a landscape designer, he already knew that plants interacted with each other in complex ways, but he had never thought about the possibility of using this natural interdependence to create something that would visually demonstrate the universal connection of all phenomena. That's when he had the most ambitious idea of his career: create a garden that functioned as a living demonstration of cosmic interdependence, an ecosystem so perfectly balanced and interconnected that anyone who visited it would automatically understand how everything in existence depends on everything else. The logic was impeccable. If he could create an environment where each element visibly depended on all other elements, where removing any component would cause obvious effects throughout the entire system, people could see interdependence happening in real time. It would be philosophy transformed into sensory experience. Liu began making plans for what he called the Garden of Universal Revelation. It would be a project that combined the most advanced horticultural techniques with profound philosophical principles. Not just a beautiful garden, but a garden that teaches about the fundamental nature of reality. He spent months studying specific ecological relationships: which plants benefited which other plants, which insects were essential for which processes, how different types of soil affected different species, what kind of stones influenced water pH. It was scientific research applied to spiritual ends. The initial project involved creating interdependent microsystems where each component would have a specific and visible function in maintaining the whole. Plants that naturally purified soil for other plants, fish that fertilized water for aquatic plants, birds that dispersed seeds in specific patterns. It would be like watching a documentary about ecology, only live and in 3 dimensions. Liu presented the idea to the emperor as an educational garden about cosmic harmony. It was a proposal that combined entertainment, beauty, and educational value. The emperor, always interested in projects that made him appear wise and innovative, immediately approved the project and gave almost unlimited resources for its execution. That's when Liu realized he had committed to something much more complex than he initially imagined. Creating a beautiful garden is one thing. Creating a garden that demonstrates universal principles of existence is completely different. It was like the difference between cooking a tasty meal and cooking a meal that reveals the secrets of the universe. But Liu was confident. After all, he was the empire's best landscape designer. If anyone could transform philosophy into practical horticulture, it would be him. He had technical knowledge, abundant resources, and an experienced team. How could it go wrong? Apparently, the universe was about to give him a practical lesson about the dangers of trying to micromanage cosmic interdependence. Because when you decide you're going to control an ecosystem for educational purposes, nature has very creative ways of demonstrating who's really in charge. And Liu was about to discover that some lessons about humility come disguised as gardening disasters on an imperial scale. Here's the translation of the 7th part. In the first year, Liu decided to start small. Relatively small if you consider controlling all of nature small. He set aside an area of the imperial garden for his experiments, not just any little corner, a section the size of an entire village, because if you're going to prove universal interdependence, you better have enough space for the universe to cooperate. Liu began importing plants from across the entire empire, not common plants. Specific plants he had researched for months, each chosen for its exact role in the ecosystem he was creating. Tibetan orchids that purified air, ferns that regulated humidity, flowers that attracted specific insects that fertilized other specific plants. It was like assembling a clock, only made of living things that had their own opinions. The plan was simple. Each plant would depend on other plants in such an obvious way that anyone could see the connections. Visitors would walk through the garden and think, wow, look how everything is connected. Instant enlightenment through horticulture. Genius. Liu hired specialists from each region, masters of aquatic plants from the south, experts in mountain flowers from the west, even a guy who knew everything about moss, because apparently moss is also part of cosmic interdependence. Who knew? He created detailed maps showing how each species would interact with others. Diagrams with arrows connecting plants to insects, insects to birds, birds to seeds, seeds back to plants. It looked like the most complicated family tree in history, only with petals. The first months were promising. Plants grew, insects appeared, birds visited. Liu walked through the garden every morning, checking if interdependence was working as planned, and it was. Sort of. The problem started when Liu realized that nature hadn't read his diagrams. Plants did what they wanted, not what the maps said they should do. Orchids died in places where they should thrive. Insects ignored specific flowers and attacked others. Birds ate seeds they were supposed to scatter. Liu interpreted this as a design failure. Obviously, he hadn't been specific enough. He needed more control, more precision. If nature was improvising, he would simply eliminate improvisation. That's when he began the second phase. Total environmental control. Liu installed irrigation systems that controlled exactly how much water each plant received. Artificial shade that regulated sunlight by zone. Even specific feeders to attract only the right birds to the right areas. He hired assistants to stand guard 24 hours a day. They had instructions to remove any insect that appeared in the wrong place, redirect birds that got lost, cut leaves that grew outside the planned pattern. Basically, Liu had created the most micromanaged garden in China, and it worked. For a while, the ecosystem followed the diagrams. Each plant did what it should do. Each insect went where it should go. It was perfect interdependence, if you ignored the fact that it needed a team of 10 people working full-time to keep everything functioning. Liu was satisfied. He had finally created a garden that demonstrated universal interdependence. Visitors could see exactly how everything was connected. It was educational, it was beautiful, and it was completely artificial. But there was a problem. Nobody was impressed. When Liu showed the garden to court visitors, they politely praised it, and Yi made comments about interesting technique and very organized. Nobody had revelations about the interconnected nature of existence. Liu was confused. How come people weren't having deep philosophical insights? He had created a perfect ecosystem. Each connection was obvious. Each dependency was clearly marked. There were even signs explaining the relationships between plants. That's when one of the visitors, an old Taoist sage, made a comment that changed everything. "Your garden is very interesting, Liu, but I wonder, if you need to control so much for it to work, are you really demonstrating natural interdependence?" It was a simple observation, and completely devastating. The Taoist sage's observation hit Liu like a stone to the stomach, but instead of rethinking his approach, he decided the problem was lack of subtlety. If people couldn't see natural interdependence in a super-controlled garden, obviously he needed more control. Made sense. Genius. Liu began the third phase of the project, total invisible control. If visitors were complaining that the garden seemed artificial, he would simply hide the controls. Underground irrigation systems, assistants disguised as normal gardeners, bird feeders camouflaged as natural decoration. It was like creating a theme park about wild nature, with the difference that nobody knew they were in a theme park. And Liu thought this would solve everything. He hired more people, many more people. There were specialists in imitating bird sounds to attract specific species, people trained to scatter seeds in exact places, even someone whose only function was to ensure butterflies followed planned routes. Because apparently, butterflies also need professional guidance. Costs skyrocketed. Liu was spending more money controlling interdependence than most people spend building entire palaces. But he was convinced he was on the right path. He just needed more precision. That's when he discovered that plants have personality. And not all of them like following instructions. The Tibetan orchids kept dying despite all the care. The humidity-regulating ferns began growing sideways instead of upward, and the special flowers that should attract specific insects began attracting completely different insects. Liu interpreted this as sabotage, not human sabotage, plant sabotage. The plants were consciously resisting his perfect plan. It was the only logical explanation. He began replacing rebellious plants with more cooperative plants. When he couldn't find cooperative plants, he imported plants from different regions. When those also didn't cooperate, he tried hybrids, and when the hybrids failed, Liu had a brilliant idea. Artificial plants, not all plants, just the problematic ones. He had artisans create silk flowers so realistic nobody would notice the difference. Paper butterflies with invisible wires to simulate natural movement. Even mechanical birds that sang at the right times. The garden became perfect. Each element functioned exactly as planned. Visitors walked the paths and saw interdependence working in total harmony. Plants, insects, birds, everything connected in a cosmic dance of mutual dependence. Only none of it was real. Half the ecosystem was theatre. The other half was controlled by a team of 20 people working in shifts. It was interdependence manufactured with imperial budget, and it worked. For a while. Visitors praised the natural beauty. Some even commented on philosophical insights they had while walking the paths. Liu was finally succeeding in transmitting wisdom about interdependence through gardening. It was a complete success. Until the day it rained. Real rain. Not the controlled irrigation Liu had planned. Chaotic, unpredictable, natural rain. The kind of rain that doesn't consult diagrams before falling. The storm destroyed half the invisible controls. Irrigation systems clogged. Paper butterflies soaked. Mechanical birds rusted. And the artificial plants, well, artificial plants don't respond well to real rain. When the storm passed, the garden was a disaster. Parts worked, parts didn't work. Parts were clearly broken. It was an ecosystem with factory defects. And for the first time in 3 years, Liu saw something he hadn't planned. The real plants, the ones that had survived, began organizing themselves. Without control, without assistance, without diagrams. They simply grew where it made sense to grow. Insects appeared naturally. Birds returned on their own. It was real interdependence. Messy, unpredictable, but real. And Liu realized he had spent 3 years trying to control something that happens naturally when you stop trying to control it. It was a lesson about letting go disguised as a gardening disaster. And Liu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. After the storm, Liu had to face some uncomfortable facts. First, he had spent the equivalent of a small city's budget creating false interdependence. Second, real interdependence had appeared exactly when he stopped trying to manufacture it. Third, the emperor was starting to ask questions about the costs. Liu tried to explain the situation to the court. Yes, part of the garden was artificial. Yes, it needed a giant team to function. But it was educational. It was revolutionary. It was a living demonstration of fundamental cosmic principles. The emperor listened politely and asked how much it would cost to keep it running. The answer was embarrassing. Liu had created the most expensive garden in Chinese history, and half of it was theatre. Not exactly the kind of efficiency emperors love to finance. That's when Liu realized there was a bigger problem. He could no longer distinguish between real interdependence and controlled interdependence. He had spent so much time manipulating natural connections that he had lost the ability to recognize when they happened on their own. It was like a chef who becomes so obsessed with controlling each ingredient that they forget what real food tastes like. Liu had become an expert in artificial interdependence and completely lost about natural interdependence. He tried to save the project. Maybe he could keep only the parts that worked naturally, remove the controls, dismiss the team, let nature take its course. It was a simple idea. Too simple, apparently, because when Liu removed the controls, the garden didn't become a perfect example of natural interdependence. It became a normal garden. Beautiful, but normal. Plants grew where they wanted to grow. Insects went where it made sense to go. Birds appeared when they felt like it. It was real interdependence working perfectly. Only nobody looked and thought, wow, what a deep philosophical insight. They thought, what a beautiful garden, and moved on. The wisdom was there, but it was too subtle to be obvious. Liu was frustrated. How come people couldn't see cosmic connections in an ecosystem functioning naturally? He had created the perfect example of how everything is interconnected. Why wasn't anyone having revelations? That's when he talked to the same Taoist sage who had made the devastating observation months before. "Liu," said the old man, You're trying to make people see that water is wet. Interdependence isn't something you demonstrate, it's something you live. It was another simple comment, and once again completely devastating. The sage continued, "When you force connections, they become artificial. When you control interdependence, it stops being interdependence. It's like trying to teach someone to breathe by controlling each breath." Liu finally understood the problem. He had spent 4 years trying to prove something that doesn't need proof. Interdependence isn't a theory you demonstrate through gardening. It's a reality you experience through life. But admitting this meant recognizing that 4 years of intensive work had been based on an impossible premise. It was like discovering you had spent your entire life trying to capture wind in a bottle. Technically impressive, but fundamentally meaningless. Liu looked at the garden. It was still beautiful. Plants grew, insects flew, birds sang, everything interconnected naturally, subtly, perfectly. Only nobody needed special gardens to see this. It happened anywhere you paid attention. The irony was cruel. Liu had created China's most elaborate garden to demonstrate something any person could observe by looking at any common garden with attentive eyes. It was like building a giant telescope to show that the sun exists. And the worst part? The garden worked better when he stopped trying to make it work. It was a lesson about control versus acceptance, disguised as an imperial landscaping project. Liu began to suspect he might have chosen the wrong profession for teaching philosophy. Or maybe philosophy wasn't something you teach through any profession at all. Here's the translation of the 8th part. In the 5th year, Liu finally had an honest conversation with himself. He was sitting in the garden pavilion, looking at plants that grew naturally where they wanted to grow, and admitted an uncomfortable truth. He had spent 5 years trying to force nature to be didactic, and nature had politely refused. The revelation came when he saw a child playing in the garden. The girl wasn't looking for philosophical insights about interdependence. She was just following a butterfly. But as she walked, she naturally noticed how the butterfly went from flower to flower, how flowers attracted bees, how bees made different sounds. She was seeing interdependence happen, not because someone had planned an educational demonstration, but because she was paying attention. It was that simple. And Liu had wasted 5 years trying to complicate the simple. He decided to do an experiment. Instead of trying to teach interdependence through the garden, he would simply keep the garden beautiful and let people draw their own conclusions. No explanatory signs, no educational tours, no forced demonstrations of how everything was connected. It was harder than expected. Liu had become addicted to controlling visitors' experiences. Every time he saw someone missing an obvious connection between plants and insects, he felt like explaining. Every time a person walked right past a perfect example of mutualism, he wanted to shout, "Look how interesting." But he controlled himself. He let the garden speak for itself, and he discovered something surprising. When you stop trying to teach, people begin learning naturally. Visitors made observations Liu had never planned. Children discovered connections that weren't in the diagrams. Elderly people sat on benches and naturally contemplated cycles of life and death. The garden had become truly educational, not because it demonstrated interdependence, obviously, but because it allowed people to discover it at their own time, at their own pace. Liu realized he had confused education with demonstration. He thought teaching meant showing, but teaching, at least teaching important things like interdependence, means creating spaces where people can discover for themselves. It was like the difference between showing someone a photo of a sunset and taking the person to see the sunset happening. The photo is more controlled, more predictable. But the real sunset is what changes people. In the following years, Liu became famous for gardens that were simply beautiful, not educational in a forced way, not demonstrative of philosophical theories, just spaces where nature functioned naturally and people could observe if they wanted. And he discovered that this type of garden taught more about interdependence than all his elaborate experiments. Because when you see an ecosystem functioning without human intervention, you automatically understand that everything is connected. You don't need anyone explaining. The deepest lesson came when Liu realized he himself had learned about interdependence not through the gardens he planned, but through the gardens that grew on their own despite his plans. Nature had been his teacher all along. He had just been too stubborn a student to pay attention. Years later, when people asked about the secret of Liu's gardens, he would answer, "The secret is having no secret. You plant, water when necessary, and let nature do what it knows how to do. Interdependence happens by itself. You just need to get out of the way." It was the simplest and most difficult answer he had learned. Simple because it was obvious. Difficult because it had taken 5 years of obsessive control to reach the conclusion that obsessive control was the problem. Liu had discovered that the best way to teach about interdependence is to stop trying to teach about interdependence. It was the kind of wisdom that only makes sense after you spend years doing exactly the opposite. And every time he saw a garden growing naturally, Liu would smile, remembering that sometimes the deepest lesson is that you don't need lessons. You just need to pay attention to what's already happening. And so ends the story of the gardener who wanted to cultivate cosmic interdependence. Liu discovered that the best way to demonstrate natural connections is to stop trying to demonstrate natural connections. 5 years forcing nature to be didactic when it was already educational on its own. But human obsession with controlling the uncontrollable apparently has no geographical limits. Because in 16th century Switzerland, a clockmaker was convinced he could measure timelessness through extreme temporal precision. Johann Zeitlos had decided that if he could create clocks precise enough, he could prove that time is an illusion. It was basically the same obsession as Liu's, only instead of trying to cultivate abstract concepts through plants, he wanted to chronometer eternity through gears. The difference is that plants at least die when you force them too much. Clocks simply break, and breaking can be quite loud. Johann Zeitlos was the most respected master clockmaker in Bern in the 16th century. Not just any craftsman, the guy who created clocks for cathedrals, palaces, and important people who needed to know exactly what time it was so they could properly complain about how slowly time passed. Johann was obsessed with precision. His clocks didn't simply work, they worked perfectly. Each gear cut by hand, each spring calibrated with mathematical precision. It was the kind of perfectionism that made other craftsmen cry and give up the profession. His workshop was a temple dedicated to time, clocks of all sizes covering every surface. The sound was hypnotic, hundreds of tick-tocks in slightly different rhythms, creating a temporal symphony that either completely relaxed you or caused nervous breakdown. Depended on the person. Johann lived by time. He woke up at exactly 5 in the morning, worked until exactly noon, lunched for exactly 30 minutes. It was as if he himself were a human clock, efficient, predictable, and a bit scary to watch. His life was going well until the day he met a Franciscan monk called Brother Alberto. The friar was in town to repair the local church clock and ended up visiting Johann's workshop to buy some parts. It was a casual conversation that changed everything. "Time is interesting," commented the friar, observing the clocks. "We spend so much effort measuring something that actually doesn't exist." Johann stopped working. "What do you mean it doesn't exist?" Brother Alberto smiled. "Time is a mental construction. Past is gone, future isn't yet. Only now exists, and now has no measurable duration." It was the kind of philosophical conversation that should end with interesting, thanks for visiting, but Johann became obsessed. If time was an illusion, why were his clocks so precise? If only the present existed, how did chronometers work? It was a paradox he couldn't ignore. Johann began researching. He read texts about philosophy, theology, even some suspicious writings about mysticism that circulated discreetly among intellectuals. Each text confirmed the same thing. Linear time was a human concept. Eternity was absence of time, and temporal measurement was fundamentally artificial. But Johann was a clockmaker. His entire life was based on dividing time into measurable pieces. The idea that he was dedicating his career to measuring something non-existent was disturbing. Like someone who discovers they spent years perfecting techniques for counting unicorns. That's when he had the most ambitious idea of his career. If time was an illusion, He would prove it by creating clocks that demonstrated the inherent contradiction of temporal measurement. Clocks that would work so perfectly they would reveal the very impossibility of chronometering eternity. The logic made sense in his head, more or less. If he could create clocks precise enough, eventually he would reach the point where precision would reveal there was nothing to be precise about. It was like trying to measure silence with increasingly sensitive instruments. Johann announced to his wife that he was starting a special project, not just a clock, a series of clocks that would demonstrate the illusory nature of time through temporal perfection itself. She listened politely and asked if this would affect the family income. "On the contrary," Johann replied, "I'm going to create the most revolutionary clocks ever built. They'll change how humanity understands time." His wife, Martha, had lived with an obsessive perfectionist long enough to recognize when he was entering dangerous territory, but Johann was already planning. Clocks that would measure different types of time simultaneously, chronometers that would contradict themselves purposely, even a special clock that would work perfectly but wouldn't indicate hours. It would be temporal precision applied to demonstrating that temporal precision was impossible. It was a project that combined advanced engineering with abstract philosophy. Basically, it was asking for trouble. Here's the translation of the 9th part. In the first year, Johann began with simple experiments. Relatively simple, if you consider revolutionizing human understanding of time simple. He decided to create clocks that measured time in different ways to prove that temporal measurement was arbitrary. The first project was a clock with two faces. One showed solar time, based on the sun's position. The other showed absolute time, based on perfect mechanical movements. The idea was that eventually the two would diverge, proving there was no real universal time. Johann worked for months calibrating the mechanisms, each gear cut with microscopic precision, each spring tested hundreds of times. It was perfectionism applied to demonstrating that perfection was impossible. The irony wasn't lost on Martha. When he finally finished, the clock worked exactly as planned. The two faces showed slightly different times. Johann was ecstatic. He had finally created physical proof that time was an artificial construction. It was revenge against his own profession. He showed the clock to other craftsmen in the city. He expected reactions of shock, revelation, perhaps collective existential crisis. Instead, he received polite comments about interesting technique and very creative. Nobody had deep philosophical insights. They just thought it was a complicated clock. Johann was frustrated. How come people couldn't see the obvious implication? He had scientifically demonstrated that time wasn't universal. Why was everyone treating it like a technical curiosity? That's when he realized he needed to be more direct. If he wanted people to understand that time was an illusion, he needed to create clocks that forced that conclusion, clocks that were impossible to ignore. Johann began the second project. A clock that would work perfectly but show random times. Not wrong times, random times. The idea was to demonstrate that if time were real, precise clocks couldn't function with false information. It took 6 months to build. The mechanism was a work of art. Swiss precision applied to generating controlled temporal chaos. It was like creating a precision machine specifically to produce precise imprecision. The result was technically impressive and completely useless practically. The clock worked perfectly, but said it was 3 o'clock when it was actually 8, then jumped to midnight, then back to 2 in the afternoon. It was a clock that was functional and dysfunctional simultaneously. Johann showed it to his family. "Don't you understand?" he asked enthusiastically. "If time were real, this shouldn't work, but it works perfectly. Therefore, time is an arbitrary convention." Martha looked at the clock, then at her husband, and gently suggested that maybe he was overthinking things. But Johann was just warming up. The third project would be the most ambitious. A clock that would measure real time versus perceived time. It would have faces for objective time, subjective time, philosophical time, and absolute time. It would be a 4-dimensional temporal chronometer. Construction took an entire year. Johann created separate mechanisms for each type of time. One based on celestial movement, another on human heartbeats, a third on, well, nobody was sure what the third was based on. Johann said it was pure temporal intuition. When finished, the clock was a mechanical monstrosity. 4 faces, dozens of gears and sounds that resembled metal torture. It worked, technically, but it showed 4 completely different times simultaneously. Johann was convinced he had finally created definitive proof. Time wasn't universal because his 4 chronometers never agreed. It was irrefutable evidence that temporality was a human illusion. Everyone just thought he had built a very elaborate broken clock. In the 3rd year, Johann decided the problem wasn't the clocks, it was lack of context. If he wanted people to understand that time was an illusion, he needed to create an environment where the illusion became obvious. An entire workshop dedicated to demonstrating the artificial nature of time. Johann transformed his workshop into a temporal laboratory. He installed dozens of clocks, each calibrated to different definitions of time. Solar time, sidereal time, mechanical time, time based on burning candles, even time based on plant growth. It was like a museum of time, only more confusing. The idea was that visitors would enter and be surrounded by contradictory chronometers. Impossible to ignore that time wasn't universal when you had 50 clocks showing 50 different times. It was proof through temporal saturation. Johann hired assistants to explain each clock. They had to memorize speeches about how each measurement method revealed different aspects of temporal illusion. It was like a guided tour through the non-existence of time. Educational and existentially disturbing. The first visitors were polite. They listened to the explanations, asked intelligent questions about the mechanisms, praised the technical creativity, and completely missed the philosophical point. They left impressed with the engineering, not enlightened about the nature of time. Johann was frustrated. How come people could see 50 contradictory clocks and still believe time was real? It was like showing 50 different maps of the same city and people, assuming the city constantly changed shape. That's when he had his most desperate idea yet. If passive demonstration didn't work, he would force active experience. He would create clocks that would stop working randomly, forcing people to confront psychological dependence on temporal measurement. Johann installed special mechanisms in several clocks. They would work normally for random periods, then stop completely without warning. When asked why they stopped, he would explain that time had temporarily stopped existing. It was psychology applied through clockmaking. The experiment was a disaster. Visitors got irritated when clocks stopped. They wanted to know if it was broken, how much it would cost to fix if there was a warranty. Nobody interpreted it as a philosophical lesson about the illusory nature of time. They interpreted it as bad customer service. Johann tried to explain. Don't you understand? When the clock stops, time doesn't disappear. You continue existing. Therefore, time and timekeeping are different things. People listened politely and asked if he knew any more reliable clockmakers in the city. But Johann didn't give up. He decided he needed a more dramatic approach. He created a special clock that would work perfectly, but have a blank face. No numbers, no hands, no indication of time, just perfect gears, moving nothing. It took months to build. It was a masterpiece of precision applied to total absence of information. Swiss mechanism working perfectly to show absolutely nothing. It was Zen applied to clockmaking. When Johann showed the final clock, he expected people would finally understand. Here was definitive proof. Perfect clock that didn't measure time because time didn't exist to be measured. It was the logical conclusion of all his research. Martha looked at the clock running silently with its empty face and made a devastating observation. Johann, you spent 3 years building increasingly complicated clocks to prove that clocks are unnecessary. Isn't that somewhat contradictory? It was a simple question, and completely devastating. Johann looked at the workshop full of contradictory chronometers, stopped mechanisms and clocks that measured nothing. 3 years of intensive work to demonstrate that work was unnecessary. It was temporal irony on an industrial scale, and for the first time in 3 years, Johann didn't know what time it was, and he discovered it didn't matter. After Martha's devastating observation, Johann had to face some uncomfortable facts. First, he had spent 3 years and a fortune creating clocks to prove that clocks were useless. Second, his workshop looked like an asylum for chronometers with mental problems. Third, he could no longer sell normal clocks because people thought he had lost his mind. Johann tried to explain the situation to potential customers. Yes, he had created clocks that didn't work properly on purpose. Yes, this proved that time was an illusion. No, this didn't mean he had forgotten how to make normal clocks. People listened politely and bought clocks from other craftsmen. His reputation was ruined. Bern's most precise clockmaker had become known as that guy who makes philosophical clocks. It was like being famous for selling food that purposely doesn't nourish. Technically impressive, commercially suicidal. Johann realized there was a bigger problem. He could no longer distinguish between real time and conceptual time. He had spent so much time thinking about time that he had lost the ability to simply live in time. It was like becoming so obsessed with analyzing music that you forget how to listen to a song. It was cruel irony. Trying to prove that time was an illusion, Johann had become a prisoner of his own temporal obsession. He spent hours calculating how to demonstrate that hours didn't exist. He timed experiments about how timing was artificial. It was temporal metacognition in an infinite loop. The workshop was chaotic. Clocks running at different speeds created constant temporal cacophony. Johann could no longer work in silence because he was accustomed to the contradictory mechanical symphony. It was like being addicted to specific noise that only he understood. Martha gently suggested that maybe he should go back to making normal clocks. Johann resisted the idea. After 3 years revolutionizing temporal understanding, how could he go back to simply measuring time? It was unacceptable regression, but creditors were starting to appear. Expensive materials, assistants, elaborate experiments, everything cost real money that needed to be paid in real time. Johann had discovered that while time might be an illusion, debts were definitely real. That's when he tried to apply temporal philosophy to practical problems. If time was an illusion, then deadlines were arbitrary. If chronometry was artificial, then accumulated interest was conceptual. It was impeccable logic that impressed absolutely nobody in the Swiss banking system. Johann had a revealing conversation with the bank. "You don't understand," he explained to the manager. "Time is a mental construction. These deadlines are based on artificial measurements of something that doesn't fundamentally exist." The manager responded that the existence or non-existence of time was irrelevant to the bank's collection policy. It was a confrontation between temporal philosophy and financial reality. And financial reality won by technical knockout. Johann began to suspect he might have chosen the wrong profession for questioning time. Or maybe questioning time wasn't something you do through any profession at all. It was possible that some truths about existence didn't need to be demonstrated through precision engineering. He looked at the workshop, full of contradictory chronometers, and had an epiphany. Maybe the problem wasn't that time was an illusion. Maybe the problem was that he was trying to prove philosophical truth through mechanical methods. It was like trying to measure love with a ruler or capture music in a bottle. The simplest observation came when Johann realized that during 3 years of temporal experiments, he had completely lost the notion of how time actually worked in daily life. He was so busy proving that time didn't exist that he forgot to live in the time he had. It was a lesson about presence disguised as a crazy clock-making project, and Johann finally understood that maybe some truths about time could only be discovered by stopping trying to measure them. In the 5th year, Johann finally had an honest conversation with himself. He was sitting in the workshop surrounded by clocks that worked perfectly but served no practical purpose, and admitted an uncomfortable truth. He had spent 5 years trying to chronometer eternity, and eternity had refused to cooperate. The revelation came when he saw a child playing in the street in front of the workshop. The boy wasn't thinking about the illusory nature of time. He was simply running after a ball. But as he played, he naturally lived in the present, not worrying about past or future, just being. The boy was experiencing real timelessness, not because someone had built a special clock to demonstrate philosophical concepts, but because he was completely absorbed in the moment. It was that simple. And Johann had wasted 5 years trying to complicate the simple. Johann decided to do an experiment. Instead of trying to prove that time was an illusion through complicated clocks, he would simply spend an entire day without looking at any chronometer, without measuring, without calculating, without timing. Just living. It was harder than expected. Johann had become addicted to temporal measurement. Every time he did something, he automatically calculated duration. Every time he heard tick-tock, he thought about mechanical precision. It was like trying to forget music after spending years analyzing every note. But he persisted. He worked without a chronometer. He ate when hungry. He rested when tired. It was strange at first, but gradually he discovered something surprising. When you stop measuring time, you don't lose time. You just live it differently. Johann realized he had confused understanding with demonstration. He thought understanding meant proving through engineering, but understanding timelessness, at least understanding in a way that matters, means experiencing total presence. It was like the difference between reading about swimming and jumping in the water. The clocks were technical manuals. Presence was the real ocean. In the following months, Johann returned to making normal clocks. Not because he had given up the philosophical quest, because he had discovered that making clocks with total presence was a more direct way of understanding time than building contradictory chronometers. Each gear cut with complete attention, each spring calibrated with full consciousness. He was no longer trying to prove a theory about time. He was living a direct relationship with time through work, and he discovered that this kind of clockmaking taught more about temporal nature than all his elaborate experiments. Because when you do something with total presence, you automatically transcend concern with duration. You don't need anyone explaining. The deepest lesson came when Johann realized he himself had learned about timelessness not through the clocks he planned, but through moments of work where he completely lost track of time. Presence had been his teacher all along. He had just been too complicated a student to pay attention. Years later, when people asked about the secret of Johann's new clocks, he would answer, "The secret is having no secret. You make each piece with total attention and let time take care of itself. Presence happens naturally. You just need to stop chronometering it." It was the simplest and most difficult answer he had learned. Simple because it was obvious. Difficult because it had taken 5 years of obsessive complication to reach the conclusion that obsessive complication was the problem. Johann had discovered that the best way to understand timelessness is to stop trying to measure timelessness. It was the kind of wisdom that only makes sense after you spend years doing exactly the opposite. And every time he heard a clock running smoothly, Johann would smile, remembering that sometimes the deepest lesson about time is that you don't need lessons about time, you just need to be present to what's already happening. And so we reach the end of another journey through the eternal absurdities of the human condition. 4 people trying to force transcendence, discovering it escapes like water through fingers. The quest for spiritual perfection is universally imperfect. And maybe that's exactly what makes it perfect. Because every time someone tries to capture the uncapturable, life politely reminds us that some things only work when you stop trying to make them work. The wisdom they all sought was already there from the beginning, not in secret formulas, just waiting to be recognized through simple acceptance of what is. It's like discovering the key was in your pocket all along, embarrassing but liberating. The most comforting truth? You don't need to become perfect to find peace. You just need to stop resisting the fact that you're already magnificently imperfect. If this type of reflection resonates with you, give the video a like. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about ancestral wisdom discovered through absurd obsessions. And tell me in the comments, which philosophy would you like to see in the next episode? Taoism, Stoicism, Sufism. Until next time, good night.